Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our eighth event here in our virtual research showcase series. My name is Stephen Roach. I'm a member of the Acer consulting team who's helping to coordinate this webinar and this event series that many of you have been part of. And it's great to see so many familiar names as we look into our chat in the waiting room here. So welcome again. If you are someone who would like to listen to our session today in the French channel, remember that all of our webinars are offered in both English and French. So we have a French interpreter with us today. You simply need to click the interpretation button at the top or the bottom of your screen rather, and then click the French option and mute original audio. If you need any help at any time, whether it's related to translation or something else, just pop in the chat there at the bottom of your screen and send us a message. You'll be able to communicate directly with one of us who are managing the call today, and we can go from there. As I mentioned, today is our eighth event in a series of about 15 to 20 virtual showcases that are highlighting dairy researchers and dairy research projects that have been conducted over the last several years across Canada. Additional details on our upcoming events are going to be shared towards the end of this showcase. I want to remind everyone that this is a traditional Zoom meeting, which means that you have the ability to turn your camera on and your microphone on. But for best audio quality, I'll ask that you remain on mute. You can certainly keep your camera on. And if there's time at the end of our session and we have a bit more time for Q&A, you might be able to ask a question directly to our researcher, who is Dr. Trevor DeVries today. If you're unable to, or we don't have time, I'd encourage you at any time during our webinar today to pop your questions into the chat. That will go directly to myself and or one of our team members who can bring that to Trevor to either answer live at the end of his presentation. And if we don't have time, we'll make sure that he can answer that in writing after the fact. And we'll share that out with everyone in addition to a recording of this webinar to make sure you've got that information as you need it. If you need any other assistance, again, pop in the chat. That's the best way to communicate with us as we go forward. Other than that, I want to give a moment here to acknowledge the Dairy Farmers of Canada, who are ultimately the main sponsor of the research you're going to see showcased today, as well as this virtual webinar series. Amy Desoleil is here with us today to give us a little bit of a welcome. So Amy, I'll hand it over to you for a moment.
Thank you, Steve, for the introduction. So yes, my name is Amy Desoleil. I'm Assistant Director Research at Dairy Farmers of Canada. I just want to thank you all for registering for today's webinar. This webinar series was launched by DFC last fall as part of our ongoing commitment to research communication and knowledge translation. This webinar series aims at showcasing the exciting work that is going on in their research across Canada. This initiative is possible thanks to the financial support of DFC and also its partner. I also want to thank Dr. Trevor DeVries and actually all the research teams from across the country for their collaboration on this initiative, and Acer Consulting for organizing these events. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over back to you again, Steve. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. So let's get right into the meat of our conversation today. I'm going to introduce our speaker, which is Dr. Trevor DeVries. I know many of you, just knowing the relationships, know Trevor and certainly some of the work he's been doing, but just as a way of introduction, Dr. Trevor DeVries is a professor and Canada Research Chair in the Department of Animal Biosciences at the University of Guelph. He received both his Bachelor of Science and his PhD from the University of British Columbia in 2001 and 2006, respectively. In 2007, he was appointed as faculty with the University of Guelph in the Department of Animal Biosciences. And in that position, Trevor leads a highly productive research program and has published over 195 peer-reviewed papers focused on dairy cattle nutrition, management, behavior, and welfare. Trevor is also committed to extending that work to the field, as evidenced by over 300 invited research presentations, one of which you might have seen last week and another, of course, here today. Trevor also contributes to teaching at the university, including instructing undergraduate and graduate courses in the areas of dairy cattle management, behavior and welfare, coaching the University Dairy Challenge team, as well as mentoring graduate and undergraduate students. Trevor is also working diligently in public service, serving on several university committees, as well as various local, national, international professional committees. Trevor, thanks so much for being here today, and please take the floor and you can go ahead and share your slides and walk us through your presentation today.
Great. Thanks, Steve, for the introduction, and hopefully you can see my presentation.
Yep, you're good to go.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Yeah, and thank you for the introduction. Thank you to DFC for sponsoring this virtual showcase, and it's a pleasure to present on this project, which is, as mentioned, a cluster-funded project under the Dairy Research Cluster 3. This is and I'm going to acknowledge that right off the top here. This was a collaborative study actually done with colleagues from across Canada, including those from the University of Calgary, including Dr. Karen Orsel there and Dr. Ed Pager, the University of Saskatchewan, Dr. Greg Penner and Dr. Tim Matsvangwa, and then also from here at the University of Guelph, Dr. Todd Duffield and myself, and various graduate students and research assistants who contributed to the work that I'm going to be describing here today. I guess the premise for the study that I'm going to be speaking about specifically today kind of comes out of the reality that we know that robotic milking is and continues to grow dramatically in Canada. And this is some recent data that comes from Lactanet from last month, just showing the number of farms across Canada that are on milk recording and currently milking with robots. And so almost 1,000 farms, 16.5% of the dairy farms, some provinces that's pushing well over 25% of the farms. And that's really, again, it's been high for a number of years, but if we go back 15, 20 years, that was only like a 1 or 2% of the industry. And so we've seen a dramatic growth in the number of robot farms, probably at least, including those not on milk recording, at least probably closer to 1,500 farms, I would guess. So we're looking at between 15 to 20% of our industry milking with robots currently. And so some of the interest for our cluster projects was to get a sense of knowing that we have such growth in this part of the industry, to take a step back and look at, okay, well, where are we at as far as benchmarks go? And then what are kind of the factors or variables that are really associated with production efficiency and health on these dairy farms. And so that's what we set out to do as part of our cluster project. And so part of that project, we enlisted almost 200 robot farms, so 197 robot farms from across Canada. And I'm gonna interchange the words robot and automated milking, and just because, again, those are quite commonly used within the industry. Now, at the time when we recruited these farms, this was early in 2019, the sample of farms represented about 25% of those farms milking with robots that were on milk recording at that time period. And so I can say that, yeah, this is a very good representative sample of the industry at that time, and probably still close to today. We look at the kind of demographics of those farms, as you see in this chart here, what you see is that, yeah, the average kind of robot farm that we looked at as part of the study is fairly representative of the average Canadian farm, for anything from very small farms to larger farms. The mean number of lactating cows maybe just a little bit higher than kind of our national average. On the right side, we have production averages, and again, fitting very well with what we'd consider typical within our Canadian industry. Now, specifically looking at the Holstein herds, which made up the majority of those herds that we looked at as part of this project, if I benchmark the production numbers from our study versus all the farms in Canada that are milking with Holsteins, what we see is that the numbers are very comparable, if not even maybe on the production side of things. For example, the milk yield is slightly higher in those robot farms compared to the national averages, and milk protein as well. And fat being very similar, and somatic cell count actually being similar as well. Part of the study was not only to look at obviously the demographics, but also different housing and management types across these farms. And again, just a snapshot of a few of the things that we saw, particularly kind of some variability in across the country. And this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but I highlighted these because these are some of the things that I'll come back to in my presentation, specifically some of these things. So of the nearly 200 farms, the majority of those from a cow traffic system. So basically how the cows are directed to the robot, whether or not they need to pass through some kind of gating system in a guided system, was only about 12% of the herds, whereas 88% of the herds were free traffic, basically meaning no directional gating needed for those cows. Majority of those farms are free stalls. About as far as those free stalls go, almost 60% yet using mattress bases on their stalls, 40% as deep bedding. And then across all those different types of stalls, we saw about 25%, just over 25% of those using inorganic bedding, so sand bedding as opposed to organic substrates. Now, what we did as part of this study was specifically look at trying to associate some of the housing management, nutritional factors that we observed on these farms with some of the production outcomes, as well as health-related outcomes that we were able to collect as part of this project. And that's really what I'm going to get to in this presentation. But before we get there, what I wanted to kind of set up is the idea that yeah, we've seen this dramatic growth in the adoption of robotic technology, largely because some of the benefits that it provides. And this was actually a focus of a previous cluster project. And I wanted to bring that up because it kind of sets up why we did this follow-up study. And so in the Dairy Research Cluster 2, we conducted a large survey at that time, again, of over 200 producers, representing at that time about a third of the dairy farmers in Canada who were milking robots and on milk recording at the time. And we surveyed those producers to really try to gain understanding of what benefits they were perceiving with the adoption of robotic milking on their farms. And this is kind of a short list of the primary things that we observed as part of that study. So greater milking frequency and yield, potential for greater cow health and repro, more information use and using that for herd management purposes, less and more flexible use of labor, and improved profitability and quality of life. And I think that's interesting to note because that's something that keeps coming back, not only in Canadian studies, but also in other studies that have been done in the US and other parts of the world, where it's not only the use of technology from a labor saving standpoint, but also from a personal life kind of standpoint as well. And when we dug into that as part of that previous study, and we asked producers about how the change to robotic milking had affected their quality of life on a scale of 1 to 5, the average response was 4.5, and very similar to the question of whether or not it met their expectations, and higher than their perception of their improvement in profitability, which was positive as well. And I think that's important to note because that's part of what's driving some of this movement to robotic milking technology. The other question that we asked in the series of questions actually at that time was how the move to robotic milking actually affected their cows' lives. And very interestingly, the response from producers was the same as their own quality of life. So on a scale of 1 to 5, on average, they rated the improvement to the quality of lives of their cows as being 4.5 out of 5, so very strong. And so that kind of begs the question, and coming out of that study was the question of, well, what are those improvements, right, that we're really seeing from a cow's life standpoint? And again, we didn't really ask those questions specifically, but if we start thinking about what opportunities we have with robotic milking, particularly from a cow standpoint, I think we can kind of group, at least in my view, group those benefits under kind of two umbrellas that actually kind of tie together. And the first being behavioral freedom. And one of the keystones to robotic milking is the fact that it is voluntary, and we're giving agency to the cow, so to speak, to milk voluntarily on her own schedule. And so in doing that, we're allowing that cow more behavioral freedom in terms of her time budget, and in terms of when she eats, when she lies down, when she goes to milk, when she drinks. And so all those things that we know, cows need to do, but putting that kind of back in her hands, so to speak, or her feet, so to speak, and allowing her to do that. And then at the same time, and that's something that, again, was perceived by the producers in that previous study, was the fact that we can then, potentially achieve better health and production out of those cows. And I think those two things go hand in hand. The one thing that we realize, and we have to be cognizant of, and always be aware of, is the fact that just because these may be benefits, it doesn't guarantee that they're actually going to happen. And so even though they can be realized, doesn't necessarily always mean that they actually do occur. And this was actually highlighted as part of that study. We asked producers in the case of that previous survey study whether or not they experienced changes in production and changes in milk quality with the adoption of robotic milking. And one of the questions was, did your somatic cell count increase, decrease, or stay the same after you went from conventional to robotic milking? And what was interesting is we took the responses from those producers and then actually compared it to their milk recording data to look at whether or not that matched, the actual change actually matched what the producers said happened on their farm. And this is the results of that. And these are box plots, which basically show you the mean, kind of, if we look at the kind of the dot there and the line, that's your mean and median. It kind of shows you the average number, but then the kind of the tails around that give you a spread of the various responses that we had around that. And so for those producers who said their somatic cell count went up, yes, on average they did. And for the most part, nearly all the producers actual change in somatic cell count was positive, meaning it did go up. What was interesting is that, if it was not a great thing for them in terms of it went up, then they were very aware of that. However, for those that said it decreased or did not change, while on average it did decrease or on average it did not change, there was a lot of variation around that. So some producers actually, when they said it decreased, their somatic cell count actually went up. And for many of the producers who said no change, for many it didn't, but then there's many who it did go up and it did go down. And so I think this is important because just because we may adopt the technology doesn't necessarily guarantee the success that we think maybe it should. And again, this could be a case of producers just not realizing maybe, or maybe, and again, I'm just hypothesizing here, but maybe even wishfully thinking in some cases that maybe their somatic cell count didn't go up, but it actually did. And so that kind of set up the premise a little bit for our current cluster project in terms of thinking about, okay, well, what is separating production, health, milk quality on our robotic milking farms? And can we gain a grasp of the different factors on these farms, whether it be housing, whether it be management, whether it be nutrition, that are influencing some of this variability that we do see when it comes to some of these performance indicators or outcomes on these farms. And the way that I'm going to actually frame that in terms of this presentation today and walk you through some of the research outcomes that we had as part of this cluster project, we're to actually kind of look at different impediments to good health and production on robot farms. And I've kind of lumped those under 4 different areas. So situations where cows can't milk when they want to, situations where cows don't want to go milk, and again, so related to that voluntary aspect of robotic milking, which again, as I described, is really kind of the keystone to success in robotic milking. And then there's potential situations of poor udder health management, which we'll touch on, as well as improper nutritional management. And that can also play a role there in terms of, really ensuring good health and production on these robot farms. And so starting off with situations where cows can't milk when they want to. And again, this is something that's been well studied over the years in terms of knowledge of, yeah, we know barn design and management can have a significant impact, not only on cow comfort, but specifically in a robotic situation can impact, yeah, the behavior of those cows, that voluntary milking nature of those cows. And this isn't necessarily something new either. So we've actually done a number of studies over the year, going back well over 10 years, looking at this and seeing that there are associations between kind of milking success and barn design and management. One specific result that came out of our cluster project was specifically focused on our farms in Ontario. We're able to look at how the barn design, the traffic system specifically, actually influenced milking frequency on these farms. And so of our 75 farms that we surveyed in Ontario, and we looked at their milking data from the robots on those farms, fitting with kind of that national average, between 10 and 15% of those farms were milking in a guided system, over 85% of those farms milking with free traffic. Interestingly, what we found was that even though some would suggest that maybe in guided systems we can achieve more successful milkings, less fetching, we actually saw more milkings per day in those free traffic barns, not necessarily any difference in fetching between barns. And overall, what that equated to based on the models that we had of milk production on those farms was probably about a 2.1 kilogram difference in milk yield. And I think this is interesting to note that even though, again, and from other research and from practical experience, we know that both guided and free traffic systems can be managed very well and have very similar outcomes at the end of the day, we are seeing across farms at least differences in what's actually being observed at that kind of field level. Another aspect of barn design and management, which influences, yeah, how well robots are used, is how many cows we have per robotic unit. And I wanted to highlight some data again that we collected as part of our last cluster project. In 2016, we surveyed herds in Ontario and Alberta, and the mean number of cows per robot at that time was about 49 cows, ranging from only 30 up to 63. In 2022, when we surveyed farms in Ontario, 75 farms, that mean was 44 cows, so actually even a little bit less. But in both those studies, what we see is lower milking frequency for extra cows per robotic unit. And that really starts to go down as we get up into the upper end of those units. And the reality is that in Canada, we don't necessarily put a lot of pressure on our robotic milking units. We typically, out of our 197 farms, the mean number of cows per robotic unit was just a few more, as I think 46 or 47 cows per robot. And so we're not putting a ton of pressure on it. It does become a challenge, though, as we try to milk more cows and get up to, say, 55, 60 cows or even higher. It does become a little bit more challenging for us to manage that well. And so that's just something that producers need to keep in mind. Another interesting result kind of related to stocking density and barn design is the fact that we actually saw an association in our cluster study between how much space cows were given at the feed bunk and the milk yield on those farms. And this is an interesting one, and it's actually been replicated a couple times in different studies that we've done over the years, in that traditionally or conventionally, many people have said over the years that, yeah, because cows are milking at different frequencies of the day, at different times of the day, their behavioral patterns are not as synchronized, maybe we can potentially get away with, say, less space on these robot barns and maybe even have a little bit less feeding space, because, yeah, not all cows may be always eating at the same time or as a synchronized manner as they would in a conventional system. But what this data shows is that space is still important for these cows, as we saw. Basically, for every 10 centimeters of extra space that was given at the feed bunk on these farms, within a kind of a range of on average between about 40 centimeters up to 80 centimeters per cow, we saw about 0.3 kilos extra milk yield. And so again, I think it's more of a warning for us that, yeah, we have to be careful that we don't try to limit those cows too much, because that does come at a cost. It comes at a cost from a behavioral standpoint on those animals, and we might be missing out on production on those animals on those farms as well. The other situation that affects kind of voluntary milking is not only situations where cows can go to milk when they want to, but also cows that do not want to go milk. And there could be a variety of reasons for that. And we're exploring that in a variety of different avenues in our research. One of the most kind of stark and important ones is situations where cows have poor mobility and cows have lameness. And I think we know that lameness is a concern in the industry. It's an animal welfare concern. It's a manifestation of pain in those cows. And so obviously something that we need to be aware of. The reality is, though, that in a robotic milking situation, when cows are lame and they're in pain because of that, or they're showing that because they have some pain originating from their hoof or from their leg, that's going to make those cows less willing to milk voluntarily and have consequences for those animals. And so part of the focus of our cluster project was to specifically look at the incidence of lameness or prevalence of lameness, on our study farms, and look at what factors were associated with that and what outcomes were also influenced by that. And so we were able to score cows on 75 farms in Ontario for lameness, looking at clinical lameness. So these are basically cows that are on a scale of 1 to 5 that are a 3 or higher. And so these are anything from our monitor and lame cows, if we were thinking about our pro-action reports. And then we also scored or categorized cows as being severely lame. So those are the 4s and 5s. Now, if we look at the numbers we have here, the severely lame cow numbers are fairly low. Many herds actually having 0% of those, on average only about 3%. And so I think that's good. And I think that's probably reflects the fact that we know that those cows are going to be very obvious, particularly in a robotic scenario, and they're going to be potentially treated, culled, or maybe even euthanized if needed, much probably earlier than they might be in other situations, because again, those cows are not going to be milking voluntarily, and we have other data to support that from previous work. Probably more concerning to us is the fact that in this study, we still scored over a quarter of the cows on average on those farms, 28%, as being clinically lame. And that ranged from 10 to 67% across those farms. And these are those individual farms here, anonymized by numbers here. But what you can see here is that, on the low end, 10% clinically lame cows, on the high end up to over 60% here, with an average of 28%. And that's a huge amount of variation that we're seeing here. And something that I think that we have to realize that it's still something that the industry is struggling with, and we still need more emphasis on trying to reduce that number. Now, I did want to highlight that this does come at a cost. And one of the things that we were able to look at is the effect of that lameness on or the association of that with milk production on these farms. And what we found is that every 5 percentage point increase in the prevalence of those clinical lame farms on clinically lame cows on these farms was associated with a 1 kilo drop in milk production. And so if we look at this range here, 10 to 60, let's say 65%, just for easy math, that's a 55% range. So 5 percentage points difference, that's an 11-point spread. That's 11 kilograms of milk, basically, that we could predict as difference between our herds with very high lameness and our herds with low lameness. So that's the difference between being a 41 kilogram per day milking cow herd versus a 30 kilogram herd. And so again, many things we can do from housing management, nutrition standpoint to make milk production changes on cows, but that big of a difference simply explained by the number of lame cows on farm is huge, and something again that I think we need to continually think about and be aware of as an industry, and then think about, okay, well, what are the factors or contributing factors to that lameness? And so that's another aspect of the research that we did was to try to identify then, okay, well, what factors were associated with lameness on these farms. And the reality is in this research, as well as previous studies that we've done, again, other cluster studies and other related work, the reality is that most of the factors associated with lameness prevalence on these farms are things that affect the standing and lying behavior of cows, and most specifically, things that either prevent cows from maximizing their resting time or other things that may increase the amount of time that those cows spend inactively standing on hard, wet concrete floors. And so just summarizing again, studies that we've published using Canadian robot data over the years, looking at factors associated with higher prevalences of lameness, or in this case, I've framed it as less lameness, more wider stalls, more lunge space. So basically bigger stalls that make it easier for cows to get up and down in to maximize their resting time. Use of deep sand bedding. So again, we know that from a comfort standpoint, very important for cows. Lesser stocking density in general in the pen, so having more space available to cows and specifically more bunk space. And so again, all those things are related to primarily either allowing cows to lie down when they want to and minimizing the amount of time that they spend standing when they don't necessarily need to be standing up. Specifically, as part of this most recent cluster project, just to highlight a couple things to highlight that we demonstrated, and I don't think this comes to surprise of that many people, but again, of those farms, as I mentioned off the top, just over a quarter of those farms were using sand bedding, and what we see is that those farms that use sand bedding, as opposed to any other type of organic bedding type, those farms with sand bedding had on average about 9.3 percentage points less prevalence of clinical lameness. And so that's, again, a very stark kind of difference between the amount of lameness. And this isn't necessarily probably new to many people that are listening here today. We know that cows prefer to lie in sand, and it's got a lot more forgiving on both the feet and legs of those cows, and is a more comfortable resting surface, particularly in a deep bedded situation. We also know that that can then translate not into also better health and better production. And that's something that we observed nationally, actually, not just in that cohort of farms from Ontario where we were able to look at lameness, but actually from across almost all those 200 farms, we saw a difference of about 1.5 kilograms of milk per day on those farms that were bedding their cows on sand. And so again, highlighting the importance of that comfort for those cows. We also saw an interesting association between lameness and the amount of feeding space available per cow. And similar to what I described before, when cows don't have enough feeding space, they may be forced in situations to stand and wait for feed access, or and as a result of that, we see potentially increase in active standing time in cows, basically cows spending more time on their feet than they need to. And so that would explain why we might see this association here, where again, every 10 centimeter decrease in available feeding space was associated with more clinical lameness in these cows. And so again, anything that we can do to minimize that inactive standing time, whether it's space related, whether that's management related, can have positive impacts in terms of the behavior of the cows, and then also the health of these cows in these situations as well. One other kind of interesting thing to point out in relationship to lameness was the fact that we also saw an association between the lameness and the somatic cell count of these cows on these farms as well. And we know somatic cell count being an indicator of udder health in these cows. And again, this probably originates from potentially two sources. One is that, yeah, those clinically lame cows may be in pain due to some kind of impact on them. They might not be eating as much. That might also make them a little bit more immune compromised, which might make them more at risk of udder infections. But then at the same time, we also know that these clinically lame cows, one of the risk factors is that inactive standing. And if those cows are spending more time standing inactively, particularly on hard, wet concrete floors, where, yeah, their feet might not only be affected, but the risk of poor hygiene, not only on their feet and legs, but also their udders might be higher. That might also be an indicator of potential more risk of bacterial introduction to those cows, and a more risk of udder health issues in those cows as well. And so, again, that's I think something that we need to be aware of and think about again when kind of tying some of this information together. Now, that does segue into the next topic that I wanted to kind of briefly touch on as part of this webinar here today, and that's the potential also for poor udder health management being an impediment to success. Now, I think the reality is, though, is that, as I showed you off the top, the somatic cell count as a proxy for udder health on these farms was actually not any different from on a national scale versus kind of the national average. And so that's a good news thing. When people started milking with robots, particularly if we go back 20 years, there was concern about udder health being a challenge in those robotic situations. For the most part, that kind of thought has disappeared. Some farms will experience kind of a transient increase in somatic cell count and udder health issues in the first 6 months after adoption of robotic technology. That's been documented in a number of studies. Again, it's transient. It's often related to just changes in environment, changes in management, even increased stress on those cows as they maybe make that transition. But after they've kind of settled into their environment and the management settles out, then we don't necessarily see any difference there. And we see that again, as reflected in the numbers that I presented earlier. We realize that when we think about udder health and milk quality on any farm, actually, and not just robot farms, but the risk of poor udder health and poor milk quality are often related to kind of an imbalance between host resistance and environmental pressure. And if the cows has a high resistance and we also minimize environmental pressure, then definitely no issues. But where we see issues is when that kind of that balance that's turned, where there's not enough resistance to any pressure that might be facing that animal from her environmental standpoint. And so from a host standpoint, and this is where I think again we can do a much better job, and some of our research would suggest is that we can improve behavior of the cows, minimize stress, improve nutritional status, as long as we're also keeping up with keeping udders or teats disinfected, and then at the same time making sure, and again, we don't have udders that look like the picture here, where cows are clean both from an environment standpoint and then also from a body part standpoint themselves. And thinking about then is how do we manage that, and that's again through proper bedding management, and then also maintaining good behavior patterns in those cows, where, as I mentioned before, we're not creating situations or management situations where cows are having to spend too much time standing, and their risk of poor hygiene, and particularly poor udder hygiene, goes up. One particular result coming out of our cluster project, which I thought again would be kind of neat to highlight here, is the fact that in our cluster project we did see again not only a difference in lameness and milk production, and these things again likely all tied together, is that the use of sand was also associated with much lower somatic cell count. And again, that's fairly well kind of known thing that we see in the industry, and it's really no difference in our robotic milking herds as well. Now, one other kind of unique aspect, and this wasn't part of our survey study, but I thought I'd throw it in here, and actually presented this in the virtual showcase that we did in December as part of the results associated with the mastitis network. But one of the projects that we did and associated with the mastitis network was to actually look at how we have other opportunities to improve udder health and do better from that perspective with robots. And one of the nice unique things about robots is the fact that we are milking cows on an individual basis, even down to a quarter basis, and we can actually tailor milking much better to the individual, not only during lactation and early lactation, where we can potentially increase milking frequency and achieve increased peak milk production and more persistency out of cows through some of those things, but specifically at the end of lactation, when we think about drying off cows, we can actually do a much better job. And one of the things that we know is that, yeah, there are a lot more persistent cows nowadays that are coming to the end of their lactation at a much higher level of milk production. And when that is not managed well, and if cows are, say, dried off too quickly, we can end up with situations where cows become engorged, cows start leaking milk. They may be at more risk of udder infections in that early post-dry period, as well as even into the next lactation. And then some of that engorgement also comes, and there's been other research to support that some of that also causes pain in those cows as well. And so we were able to, as part of our other cluster project done under the Mastitis Network, was to look at how we can use actually robot settings, both from a milking setting as well as a feeding setting, to more effectively bring down their milk yield prior to dry off. And you see here, and this is just an example from that study, whereas those cows that had both decreased milking frequency availability as well as feed availability in the robot, we were able to do the best job in terms of bringing their milk production down. This is decreased feeding and decreased milking, as opposed to those on the top line here that had no changes to those settings. And so again, kind of a neat opportunity that we have, not only to actually make improvements or do better from an udder health standpoint and a cow behavior and health standpoint at that time period. And the last thing I want to talk about in my presentation here and get you to think about is the potential for improper nutritional management affecting, good health and production on robot farms. And again, this is a big topic area, because we know that when we move to robotic milking, the nutritional management of those cows does change to some degree. We use feed as a way of actually attracting cows to robots, and so we see that when cows are fed in robots, we use that feed that we provide to the cows to get them there. But at the same time, we realize that the feed that we provide to those cows in the feed bunk plays as equally, if not as a more important role in terms of getting those cows to milk. And this is actually some older data, again, that came from our group, but just highlights the fact that when we look at when cows milk in a robotic milking scenario, and this is the relative frequency of milkings across the day, what we see is that there's some diurnal kind of pattern to that, whereas there's peaks in milking activity that may occur at certain times of the day. And in the case of the study here, those peaks in milking activity actually aligned with the times of feed delivery on those farms. And that's because every time the cow goes and eats at the feed bunk, whether again in a guided system or even a free traffic system, they're going to be more likely to be milked in and around those time periods. And we see in the case of this data here too, we see even some smaller bumps kind of in milking frequency associated with cows going to the feed bunk after a feed push-up. Now, when we're milking with robots, if we want to maximize the efficiency of the robots, we want to keep those lines, this line as flat as possible. We don't necessarily want times of the day where the robot gets really busy, because that means that there's probably cows lining up waiting to be milked. And if that is the case, then you might end up with cows who make the decision not to be milked, or you end up with cows who end up standing too long on their feet waiting to be milked. And so our challenge is to think about nutritional management to minimize some of those kind of peaks in milking activity and spread out their feeding activity as much as possible. Much of that's going to come through the quality of the feed that we provide to them, and then also just simply making sure that when the cows are hungry and they want to go to the feed bunk and as a result also go milk at the same time, that there is feed available to them. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how we do that. We can use technology to do that. We can do that by hand. We can do that with machines, but it needs to be done. And the reality is, and our cluster data showed that, is that the more often we do that, the more positive impact we see on those farms. And so from our national study, again, our cluster study, what we observed is that across the nearly 200 farms that we surveyed, the mean number of times per day feed was being pushed up on those farms was over 12 times per day. Over 60% of those farms were using some kind of automated technology, like you see on the bottom of the screen, to push up the feed on those farms. That being said, across the range that we observed and the frequency of that feed push-up, regardless of the type of system they're using, every 5 extra feed push-ups was associated with more milk. And so again, suggesting that, yeah, there is a greater benefit from just making sure that simply feed is available to cows 24 hours per day. Now, it sounds simple and people say, yeah, cows have feed in front of them all the time. But there are going to be periods of the day when maybe, yeah, if we aren't pushing up feed frequently enough, we're doing that manually, even in some cases that availability might not be as good as we think it is, and we see the consequences of that. And that's why we potentially see this differentiation in production between farms. The other thing that we know from a feeding management standpoint that can have a fairly significant impact on cow behavior, as well as their eating patterns and specifically their rumen health, is actually how often we deliver feed to cows. And one of our other objectives as part of this cluster project was to be able to look at different aspects of health. We talked about lameness a little bit. One specific aspect of health that we were interested in was the rumen health of these cows. And one of the proxies that we used for that was looking at the fatty acid composition of the milk on these farms. And we were able to, for our farms that we sampled in Ontario and Quebec, we were able to look at their bulk tank fatty acid profile for over a year period of time, and then associate that back to differences in feeding and management and housing on these farms. And this is one of the examples of those associations that we saw, and that was an association between how often feed was being delivered to those cows per day and their de novo fatty acid content of their milk. And de novo fatty acids are basically are the fatty acids that are formed in the udder of the cow from short chain fatty acids that are absorbed from the rumen. And really a higher proportion of those de novo fatty acids would indicate to us basically a healthier rumen, and typically situations where cows are say mobilizing less fat off their backs as well. And what we see here is that those farms that were feeding most often had the highest proportion of de novo fatty acids, typically or likely as a result of the fact that those farms, when they are feeding more often, we're seeing more consistent eating patterns in those cows, and as a result of that, a more consistent rumen environment. And I think that's interesting to point out, and we're continuing to actually work in this yet. When we did this analysis originally, we did not have all the nutritional information on those farms, and now that we have that, we're able to potentially also look at that and try to separate some of the nutritional differences on these farms and how that influences this fatty acid profile as well. Very quickly, and I just wanted to kind of leave with a couple teases, so to say, as far as what's coming, as far as some more of the data that we still have to finalize. One of the other objectives of our cluster study was to really look at some of the nutritional variation on these farms across Canada. And so this is some data that we presented last year, and we're currently working on a manuscript associated with that, looking at from feed samples that we took across different farms from across different regions in Canada, of both the feed in the feed bunk as well as feed that was provided in the robot, to look at the variability of the nutrient content of those. And then at the same time, and this is something that we've managed to put together very recently, is also copies of all the diets that were provided on these farms. So not just the nutrient profile, but also the actual individual ingredients of those diets on these farms. And we've been using both those pieces of information to actually look at how some of that diet nutrient content as well as dietary components are associating with production on these farms in Canada. And this is some very new data, and I put in preparation here. This is actually, we just put this in an abstract that's going to be presented at a scientific meeting later this year, and we're working on a manuscript associated with that. But just kind of out of interest, I threw this in. Milk yield across our farms in Canada and our robot farms was primarily associated with variability in two things. And one was the fat concentration of the PMR. So basically those herds with a higher percentage fat of their PMR made more milk. And again, we didn't have power to really differentiate the type of fat, but it's likely that there are certain fat types that are driving that difference. And then also the major forage source used in the PMR. And so we're able to differentiate farms based on the different feed ingredients and specifically look at what was the primary forage that those farms were using. And we saw that those farms that were primarily feeding either barley silage or corn silage, as opposed to haylage, either a grass or alfalfa-based haylage, those farms were also making more milk. And again, we're further working on these results, and hopefully we'll see more coming out of these analyses in the coming weeks and months, and we'll hopefully share those with you. So that gets me to the end of my presentation here. Just wanted to highlight some of the kind of key things that we found as part of this cluster study, and in general, that we know robotic milking presents many opportunities. There can be impediments to success in these systems, but what our project results really suggest that, yeah, cow health and production are optimized in robotic systems when, yeah, we ensure we have cows that have time and space to milk voluntarily, that have good comfort, clean environments, and have continuous feed access and good nutritional management. And I guess one of the things that we kind of concluded coming out of this was that, yeah, at the end of the day, kind of best practices that we know for our conventionally milking farms translate over into our robot farms and probably even become more important. So things like good comfort, good feed access, which again, we've known are very important for those conventional systems, are probably even more important in our robotic systems in terms of ensuring good success. So with that, I'd like to thank various funders of the work that I presented in here today, particularly again, the DFC through the Dairy Research Cluster program. And thank you for your attention, and hope that we have time for a question or two yet in this webinar here.
Thanks very much, Trevor. That's great. Really appreciate a deep dive into a variety of risk factors and sort of best practices in the context of robotic milking systems. It's really interesting work and a lot of chat comments here from us, or for us to dig into. Not a lot of time, so we'll maybe try and lop off a couple of them, and then we can follow up on offline for a few others. One that was prompted just from your last couple of slides there. The question was, did the number of feed push-ups have any effect on de novo fatty acid levels separate from the number of PMR feedings per day? Any insight there?
No, actually, and that was an interesting one. And so probably a couple of hypotheses there for that is that I think what feed push-ups do, and that goes back to other research that we've done in conventional systems, what feed push-ups do is really ensure that when cows are motivated to eat, that there's feed available to them. And so what feed push-ups do is really ensure that when the cow is going up for that meal, there's feed there for her, and she doesn't waste her time, and she maximizes her kind of use of her time that way, and also her intake. Whereas new feed delivery has a greater kind of role in terms of actually stimulating maybe a new meal in those cows or an extra meal on those cows. And so from that perspective, the delivery of feed actually might help kind of create more meals in that cow to keep that rumen more stable. Whereas the feed push-up is really just satisfying the fact that, yeah, when she is motivated to go to the bunk, whether that's internally because she's hungry or then that feed is available to her. And so probably doesn't surprise me then that we didn't necessarily see that association with the de novo on the feed push-up side.
Great. Another comment, well, maybe I'll add two together, a little bit more on the demographic pieces that you started off with, Trevor. So one question we had was, how did you arrive at the estimate around 1,500 robot farms in Canada? And I'll just tack something on to that. Someone had further asked, is sand bedding being used more in eastern provinces than, say, in Alberta? So different questions, but more just thinking about demographics a little bit.
Yeah, I know. Well, so if we think about, we've got about 1,000 farms currently in Canada milking with robots that are on milk recording, and we have about, and again, I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but I think it's over 6,000 farms in Canada on milk recording through Lactanet. And if we think about the total number of farms in Canada being closer to 10,000 farms, that already there probably puts us close to 1,500 cows milking with robots total, if we consider those who are not on. Also recognizing that the propensity to not be on milk recording might even be a little bit higher in farms that are milking with robots, because they're getting a lot of that information, especially cow level information, from the robots themselves. That being said, there's still benefits associated with milk recording, at least from my perspective, but that's another discussion to be had. So that's where that kind of estimate comes from. And then in terms of the difference in demographics, probably actually that distribution of use of sand is probably similar across most of the country, except actually I would say a little bit lesser in the east, very east, so to speak. So between Quebec and the Maritimes, we probably see the lower proportion of farms using sand bedding.
Great. I'll jump into one or two others. We have a question around type of robot and company. So how many of each robot type, blue, green, red, made up the 75 farms? I'm wondering if you can comment on that. And where you measured milkings per day and milk per cow per day, was there enough power to actually draw comparisons between robot color? Was that a question or something of interest?
Yeah, no, I have those numbers. I don't have them off the top of my head, and so I'm not going to make up numbers on the spot here, so I don't want to do that. We do provide in our papers, we do provide a breakdown of those so people can look those up. No, at the end of the day, and that's again the challenge is well, twofold, I guess. One is we had no predictions about kind of differences in performance between different brands, and we recognize at the end of the day that the robots that are out there in the field, they all milk cows. And so our bigger question was, what are different aspects of management around those, right, that may be influencing health and production on these farms? And so again, that wasn't a research question that we necessarily had. And then, yeah, as you kind of mentioned too, as we get down into smaller sample sizes, then it becomes even a power issue to look at some of these things. So we have to be careful that we don't draw conclusions on too small. We did make sure, again, right, that when we are looking at kind of low frequency management things, that's where a lot of times we had to actually combine or categorize different kind of management things together to actually get kind of enough power and sample size to make some of the comparisons that we did.
Great. And just one last one for us here, Trevor, and then we'll follow up for a few other questions we won't have time for related to flooring and manure management in AMS systems. But there was a question around whether you found a difference in lameness due to not enough space with the sort of feed line, whether there was a comment on a particular picture that showed locks, the poles or the line, and just some questions around that. I'm just wondering if you have any insight there.
Yeah, again, those are all things we measured. We looked at whether or not feed bunks had headlocks versus a rail or other type of system. At the end of the day, there was no kind of association there that we were able to detect. The only, as I mentioned, the only related to the feeding side of things was the actual amount of space that was available to those cows. And we even know that in any of those situations too, that while say a headlock may reduce a little bit of competitive behavior between cows, it still comes back to the amount of linear centimeters or inches of space at that bunk that really dictates how much competition we see, regardless if we're using headlocks or we're using a rail system. And so that probably also then explains why we saw the association with the space rather than the individual types of feed rails that we actually were able to observe across these farms.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate it, Trevor, and appreciate a lot of the questions and comments from others. We'll follow up offline with a few others. And just as our final parting comment here, again, want to thank Trevor and everyone for attending here today, for taking the time to listen and be part of the event. We do have another event coming up that's going to be featuring a number of researchers, most notably Dr. Andrew van der Zag, Dr. Rob Gordon, Maren McRae, and Edith Charbonneau, in the context of some of the work they've been doing. Very interesting work in climate change and sustainability. So some really interesting work there taking place at Thursday, March 15th, but at 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern. If you have any questions or follow-up comments for us, please give us a shout. Otherwise, we will hope to see you again in another webinar. And thanks again very much. Have a great afternoon.